Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've just had the first budget of the new coalition government. Finance Minister Nicola Willis has unveiled what she's planning to do with the government books over the next year and into the out years. Suffice to say, sort of a little bit of a boring budget almost with all the policy announcements that we sort of thought we were going to get. We got, and not a lot more. But certainly looking through some of the figures and the Treasury's forecast, some deeper and darker figures starting to emerge. The economy looking like it's going to be quite a lot weaker over the next wee while than was first expected. We haven't seen a contraction in the Treasury's forecast for the future years in terms of the GDP figures yet, and we did on budget day. They're picking as well, though, inflation to come back into those into the band by the end of 2024. That's good news. That's reassuring. Of course, their forecasts were put together before the latest quarter of inflation, so a little bit of worry there over the upside risk. All of that's created some quite difficult fiscal positions for the government. Over the next sort of 4 years, the government's now expected to bring in $33 billion less in revenue than it would have first expected back at the half-year update in December. About a third of that coming through from the likes of the tax cuts and the other two-thirds coming through from weaker economic conditions in the future and previously. Yes, there's some cutbacks of nearly $16 billion, but there's still quite a lot in the middle there. What did you make of the budget?
Yeah, I think it was quite important from National's point of view, at least in their own head, to try and match up the size of the tax cuts with the size of the savings that they've made elsewhere. So they could say, we're not borrowing for these tax cuts, we've done it through savings. But it is a little bit of semantics, really, when you get into it, because ultimately, like you say, debt going forward, the deficit going forward are all going to be worse than we had previously been told. And look, there's no surprises there when you look at the economic growth track. Treasuries was too strong previously, and that's impacted on where the government finds itself. It was also an interesting revision for me in terms of the corporate tax forecasts going forward, because if we go back a couple of years, Treasury have been routinely underestimating how much corporate tax would come in. They revised up that forecast model, and lo and behold, it starts to be too high on the other side, just at the time the economy starts to turn in the other direction. So quite unfortunate. They have revised them down. I think that one of the keys around that is, when we look back at the global financial crisis, we saw a big drop of about, I think, 38% in corporate tax over the course of 2 years at that point. It took another 6 years before it recovered all of that ground. And that just reflects that businesses, if they make losses along the way, they get to offset that against future profits and so don't have to pay tax there as well. So, yeah, quite a difficult financial position that the government finds itself in, yet as you say, in terms of all the policies, when you go through them, what they'd campaigned on, what we'd be seen announced ahead of the budget as well, pretty much as expected. So, wanting to make sure that they deliver and don't disappoint. I think that obviously raises some questions, though. If they are doing more borrowing, what does that do in terms of inflation going forward? I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it doesn't really matter what either of our views are, right? It's what we think the Reserve Bank looks into those figures and says. And to be fair, I feel like they might be a bit more worried than we probably are. I mean, depends on how you cut it. There is a risk, I think, with that larger borrowing program than originally expected. Debt Management Office, I think, expecting something like $12 billion more over the forecast period of government borrowing than was expected back at the half year in December. So on that basis, from the Reserve Bank's point of view, they won't be particularly keen to see those figures, because it does mean that, again, the government is still effectively borrowing to spend in the next wee while. At the same time, the Treasury has noted that overall they think that actually the spending program is more contractionary than they would have first thought, given where some of the figures come out at the end of the day. So I think the jury's still out a little bit. I think also, though, the risk we run a little bit is that the Reserve Bank has been talking tough in recent times about the inflation pressures and where the economy is, and so it doesn't, or it might not take much to push them over the line when their risk tone is in the way that it is. So that's sort of, I think, a bit worrying. Like you say, that means that the debt track is a bit higher, means the return to surplus is pushed out another year. Seems to be a pretty constant that we just, put it out right to the end of the forecast period. I think for households, they'll still be looking at those tax cuts and feeling like they've got something. Depends on who you are, but for a lot of people, it seems to be in the order of sort of $20 to $40 a fortnight. Minimum wage worker, for example, will get $25 a fortnight, so $12.50 odd a week. What is interesting is that there were 240 savings initiatives that came through in Budget 2024, which does suggest that the government has been able to find quite a lot of areas that it could save some money, which, you've got to ask or think that there might be more of those into the future. The biggest, I guess, question for me is almost, okay, Budget 24 is done, but the settings actually for future budgets could be quite difficult. The government has set itself a $2.4 billion operating allowance for Budget 2025 and on. That's over the forecast period $5.5 billion less than it originally expected. Now, Treasury says that they will need $2.5 billion next year alone just to cover the cost increases from government. So effectively, the government's now said that they're going to be running, effective zero budgets going forward. They'll have enough money to keep the lights on and deal with normal cost pressures, but nothing additional. I mean, into the future, what do you see that doing to government, both finances, but also politically in terms of new initiatives?
Yeah, it does make it difficult from a political point of view. I think, look, there will be new initiatives going forward. The government is not going to be able to simply campaign and say, we gave the money back to you last year and well, that's all we've got. Thank you very much. I mean, we've seen there hasn't been a lot of disappointment, I think, in terms of the policy announcements because it had been as expected. But one of the areas that stood out for me was around funding for cancer drugs, for example, which I think the costing was only set at around $70 million, and yet the government said, no, we can't do that. Yet we maybe will come through with it next year. I think there will have to be other sort of initiatives along the way that the government does find room for, but probably the message coming out of the numbers yesterday is if they are going to find room for stuff like that, whether it's more infrastructure, which they have, again, funded to some degree, whether it is cancer drugs, it may well have to be at the expense of other policies. So like you say, the pressure will probably still be on to try and find savings along the way in terms of keeping that fiscal position on a track towards a surplus sometime off in the future. And it is a long way off. And like you say, does seem to keep getting pushed out. I mean, one of the keys that came out of the numbers when you look at it was that government spending as a percentage of GDP is still going to remain significantly higher, a couple of percentage points higher than it was pre-pandemic. So, we've been on this massive bender in terms of government spending over the last few years. It's stimulated the hell out of the economy, and yet now we're finding it very hard to reverse it out. Now, I'm not advocating the government slash and burn any more than they already have done in terms of the public sector, for example, because we know the economy is hurting anyway. And if the government was to cut back spending by another few $1 billion on top of what we're already seeing, the recessionary effects on that would be absolutely sort of catastrophic, I think, for the New Zealand economy, guaranteeing a deeper, darker recession than we're already sort of working our way through. So it's not about going cold turkey, it's about just easing back on some of that spending and hoping that over time the economy does start to grow again and just ease some of those pressures on the fiscal position. But as Nicola Willis said, don't be holding out for any more tax cuts either, because they're not going to happen until we're back in surplus. And when you put it like that, along with the perspective that the tax cuts we've had only have reversed back the inflationary pressures of the last 2 years, not the last 14, the government there's still a lot more recalibration, I think, that has to go on if we think that the government has excessively grown over previous years.
Oh, exactly. And that's why, my expectation really is that this is the start of, continual cuts and reprioritizations rather than the end. This is not sort of just a once and done thing. It will happen every year. Any new initiative will coming in Budget 2025 or any subsequent budget will have to come in at the same time as something else gets biffed out, so to do that sort of matching as we go forward. It's also interesting, you look at some of those other figures coming through, the likes of infrastructure spending, great to see some of those bigger announcements. Actually, though, Treasury even expects that the amount of infrastructure being invested into the economy might be something like $5 billion less over the next couple of years. And it does just sort of highlight that difficulty where government in normal times should be counter-cyclical. It should be supporting the economy when it's at a weak point to try and prop up activity, almost like right now. It's just that it's been so pro-cyclical in recent times. It's been over-egging the economy. That's part of the reason we've got that high inflation. And I think that the likes of infrastructure and construction are two very clear examples where at the moment would be the perfect time normally for government to be supporting construction when consents have fallen, 25% odd over the last year. perfect time to put more of that infrastructure in as job losses start to occur. But because they were fighting the private market for money and resources in the last couple of years, the cupboard's a bit bare at the moment. So I think there is a real challenge there over, like you say, that recalibration over time. We'll assess how all of those different government programs go, and probably most importantly, what the Reserve Bank thinks about the budget and what implications that might have for interest rates on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.